Good morning.
Morning.
Hope everyone is well, maybe stuffed full of potato salad. Please feel free to shift around a little bit if it's difficult to see, or if you're like sitting here and you have to listen like this the whole time, to move your cushion or whatever you like. Welcome everyone, the various layers of our assembly. It's July 5th, and there was lots of fireworks last night. Did anyone enjoy those? I know some people have pets that get upset about the fireworks. I'm quite fond of fireworks, but I really like the ones that go up in the sky. If you live in East Asian country, it's like so central to the summertime there, the festivals and things. And so I was a little nostalgic for that last night. Usually I'm able to go to Japan in the summer, and where my teacher's temple is, and my wife's hometown Sendai, they have amazing fireworks in early August, so I won't be able to see those this year. Oh well, next year perhaps. So I had an interesting experience this week. I did something that I've only done once before in my life, and that was I listened to one of my own talks. Well, I actually watched. This is the first time I've ever done this, is watch my own talks. And how it's horrible to listen to yourself speak. I was amazed at how I agreed with everything the guy was saying. I was like, man, he's so right on. I was like, oh, wait a minute, that's me. And it was like Monday, so I had just given the talk, so I hadn't changed my mind yet, although it doesn't take long for me to change my mind. But I also noticed these talks are really long. I don't know if you felt that way, but boy, I got it like 20 minutes in. I was like, man, is he going to stop talking? And so and then I also noticed that the past several times I kind of get going, and then there isn't time for questions, which oftentimes is a place where a lot of things can come out, especially when our assembly now is such that it's hard for us to gather and to be asking these questions all the time. And so I made a decision that I would talk for a shorter period of time and make more time for questions. And so to do that, I cut a third of my paper off. And so we'll see if this was a successful strategy into cutting my notes into thirds, to see if that cuts the length of the talk down a little bit. Some teachers in Japan that I studied with, they'll talk for like 2 hours. But usually all the monks go to sleep within the first 2 or 3 minutes. The monastery where I studied, when the people would gather from the community, the monks would sit in the back. The monks are supposed to sit in the front, but they would sit in the back, and they would put all the people who are coming from the wider community in the front. And it was amazing to me how it took almost no time for all the monks to fall asleep, which is why they put the other people in front, so that they wouldn't see them sleeping. So anyway, I hope I don't put you to sleep, whether you're in the yard or online or here. This week I want to continue talking about meditation. And I particularly want to talk about the liberation that is at the root of meditation, or the freedom of meditation, which has been it's been the topic of these talks that I've been giving over the past couple months, talking about the 6 perfections, which are one of the oldest ways of talking about the Buddhist path. And we talked about forbearance or patience. We talked about vigor or zeal. And now we're talking about meditation. We'll go on to talk about wisdom and generosity and ethics. But right now, meditation. I've been trying to emphasize that each one of these facets of the path is about liberation. They collectively are about a pathway of liberation and to liberation, but each one of them themselves is about liberation. And they're not just about liberation as something that's going to happen in a far-off time or place, or after I've become really great, right? But a kind of liberation that happens immediately, but also over time can lead to a very different kind of life. This is the good news of Buddhism, right? Did you grow up having the Bible, the Good News Bible? Anyone have Good News Bibles? Yeah, that was like, what's the good news of Jesus' message? The good news of the Buddhist message is there is a path of liberation. And there's a path of freedom. But that liberation or freedom is referring to a very particular thing. It's not all the ways we might envision freedom, but it's about very clear way in which our life is bound up. That when we talk about liberation, when we talk about freedom within a Buddhist context, we're talking about a release from cyclic existence. Buddhism says that cyclic existence is this kind of foundation of how it is that we suffer. And a release from that cyclic existence is also a kind of liberation from this suffering. We'll talk a little bit more about the word suffering. Whether that's the best way to translate the word dukkha or not is a bit of a controversy. It's best really to learn the word dukkha. So within the Buddha Dharma, we talk about life as being marked by dukkha. It's really important that we understand that in a precise way. The teaching is not that life is totally and completely only suffering. One of my early mentors used to say, he said, "Oh, I don't really like Buddhism. It's too negative." He's a fabulous man, but he didn't like Buddhism very much because he thought it was too negative. Well, this is a kind of misunderstanding. If we hear this teaching as being life is only about suffering, then it sounds very, very negative. But what the Buddha Dharma says is that all phenomena are marked by suffering or marked by dukkha. They have the quality of anxiousness, of something that's unsettled. And then there is a kind of diagnosis of why is that the case? What brings about that kind of experience? What brings about a life which is marked by that kind of experience of unsettledness, of there being some kind of, what's the modern term we might use, angst, which is like right at the center of our experience. Why is it that? Why is it there? What could we do about it? Oh, just wait a minute. We're not very settled. So the Buddha's teaching tells us that the reason that we experience this way is because we're living in samsara, or we're living through samsara, which samsara itself means cyclical. It's a cycle of life and death, a cycle of arising and falling away. It's the cycle in which even when we point ourselves towards something that we think is important or wholesome, when we grab onto it, it slides through our hands. And that even when things are going well, that there is an anxiousness at knowing that things can and will slip through our hands. That we can't hold it still. Things that are present and full now will not always be present and full. Even things that are present and full now are not exactly what I think they are. Right? They're made up of all these things which are not part of what I'm just grasping onto. And because of that, these cycles emerge. You can think about just very simply in your life what kinds of cycles emerge, cycles of grasping and anxiousness. You think about security, for example, or safety. Think about the current situation with the pandemic. Of course, none of us wants to get sick. We don't want any of our loved ones to get sick. Actually, if we're a little bit heightened in our consciousness, we don't want anyone to get sick. Buddhism doesn't say that desire for flourishing is a problem or is bad. That's very wholesome, to have that intention to try to take care of each other, to protect each other. But notice what happens to your consciousness when you start retracting and your life starts to get driven by the fear of getting sick. And the way, almost immediately, you can start feeling this kind of wave of the times where you feel settled, and then the anxiousness will arise, and then it will pass, it will sort of fade away. Like, oh, Oregon's not immune from this. Duh. But then it arises, right? That's good. Maybe that's not all bad. That maybe makes us be a little more careful. We're maybe getting a little sloppy. So help us get a little more careful. Maybe that's good. But now watch what will happen if you spend some time with that. Now, the kind of tightening up to try to be better, to try to be, more protective, to try to follow the rules, it will be followed by a kind of a laxness. I mean, it just will happen. That's how it goes, right? These are these cycles. Right? Sometimes we observe the cycle from being on one side or the other. So we may think we're very good because we're all wearing our masks and we're doing this thing, we're taking control of it. And there's whole swaths of society that are like, screw it. Well, your idea about the pandemic has everything to do also with the way they're thinking about the pandemic. All the ways in which tightness and control and judgment rule your consciousness about the pandemic has a total effect on people who are saying, screw it. These liberals are trying to control me, right? Government overreach, whatever it is. And I'm not saying you're responsible for that. I'm not saying that, you're the generator of the problem, but you're involved. We're all involved. So that's another way we look at the cycle. Sometimes it's like we can see it because there's a kind of dualism that emerges. There's these kind of tensions in society or in our own heart or within our family. And we can see how those cycles emerge. So the Buddha Dharma says really clearly that these cycles are expressions of our habits. I'm translating the word karma as habit and expression as effect, right? Or effect as expression. That we have karmic cycles, and those karmic cycles present themselves as our life. What we experience moment to moment is marked deeply by the karma. The karma being all of the movements of body, speech, and mind from an antiquity that can't be grasped. They flow through us. They flow through as us. And it comes in this kind of cyclical form. And the cycle, if you think about the cycle, emerges with a center that is unsettled. It knows there isn't a place that it can rest. It knows that there isn't a place to find refuge. That's what dukkha is about. We say suffering, but suffering just sounds a little bit like someone was mean to me, I'm feeling bad, or I stubbed my toe or something like that. Or horrible things are happening. But that's not precise enough. Dukkha is about this anxiousness. Even things which are pleasurable, even things that seem like they're going well, they also contain this seed of anxiousness, this seed of dukkha. So when we talk about liberation in Buddhism, we're talking about that. Is that going to be the inevitable center of your life? Without medicine, it will inevitably be the center of your life. It will occupy the place in which the center of gravity of everything gets pulled. And this is this from a Buddhist teaching perspective. And so we need to practice the path so that dukkha is not the inevitable center. It isn't the inevitable center. It is delusion, greed, and hate which keep it going. This is the classical diagnosis. So liberation with meditation is talking about that kind of liberation. So in what way does meditation release us from the cycle of suffering? That should be our question if we're trying to understand what part does meditation play in liberation, just like all the other perfections. Excuse me just a second. Got something in my throat. So freedom. July 4th. Does July 4th represent freedom or not? I'm not sure. Actually, I'm fairly sure that it doesn't represent the kind of freedom that I want to talk about. Within the Buddha Dharma, we say that the fundamental quality of our heart and mind is freedom. Okay? Fundamental quality, fundamental aptitude of consciousness is freedom. That it is not located in inevitable cycles of suffering. It's not its innate quality to be in those cycles of suffering. But we do live in those cycles of suffering. So if we think about freedom, we think about exploring freedom, if we think about the kind of liberation that comes through practice, so much of the way we think about freedom is forward movement. It's outward types of freedom. From a Buddhist perspective, we would say that mostly this freedom is about delusion. That through delusion, we enact the fundamental freedom of our consciousness, and we enact it as a subject-object experience. Experience rooted in the subject and object, with the total freedom of your consciousness, right? You say, you're you, and I'm me, right? That fundamental separation, the creation of a self and an other, emerges very naturally. Actually, it is karma, which is moving through our life, which gives us the idea that there's a you and there's a me, and the cycle begins there. So oftentimes when we think about freedom, we think about freedom outward, right? About my freedom to enact this totally innately free heart as the subject-object relationships of the world. I'm free to go buy a slice of pizza, which I like to do, right? And eat it. But all of that process is me identifying as a self, interacting with objects that are not the self. Now that happens on very gross levels, and it happens all the way down to very subtle levels. On the gross levels, it's things like the freedom to own, the freedom to consume. This is one of my really kind of pet peeves of our modern consumerist industrial society. We have conceived of the idea that we should be free to consume simply because we are. It is my right to eat up the earth. We might not say it that clearly all the time, but we live as if that is our freedom. I mean, even if you drive a Prius, guys, you are living with that basic attitude. It would be virtually impossible to live in the current society and not to have the karma of that attitude moving through you. Right? So I'm not saying that that makes you exceptionally evil. I'm saying that just makes you garden variety evil. All right, like that's where we're living. That idea that my freedom is about being able to consume. While it wreaks havoc on the earth, it also wreaks havoc on me. I'm also imprisoned through that attitude. My own freedom is diminished in that process. Right? When I think about my freedom as being the freedom to enact myself onto a world of objects. And down on more subtle levels, if you study this, you can see how that's happening. how your sense faculties, your eye, your ears, your nose, your tongue, your body, your mind, are constantly involved in a process of othering, constantly involved in a process of creating things for me to be related to. If we look down to that more and more and more and more subtly, we'll see that we're engaged in a process of refining experience, of refining it to just get that sweet nectar that we want. Right? Very subtle ways, micro adjustments. Right? This is also a kind of outward expression of freedom. Even though it may be very internal, we might be looking in the gross aspects of this type of outward freedom. It might be consuming, it might be pushing, it might be driving around your car, it might be digging holes. I don't know what it is, all kinds of things. If you start to look inside, you'll see the same thing happening. But that inside is also outside. It's also an object of your subject. Consciousness now is split. Even if you're looking into your own psyche, you're still carrying that. So through this kind of process, we can refine experience. We can make life better. Right? And the Buddha Dharma, this is one of the things I love about the Buddha's teachings, is it says, great, make life better. But don't make a mistake. Making life better will not cure dukkha. It will not address that anxiousness, the security that you develop, right, in all kinds of different ways. While we have every reason to cultivate security, especially really wholesome security, maybe growing some vegetables. I was talking with someone the other day and I was asking them what is something that really inspires them in their life, something where they feel like I'm really on track. I'm really doing something I believe in. And they told me the story of moving into a new house recently, and maybe 2 years ago, and planting a garden. And when those first vegetables came up, cutting off the ends of maybe a cucumber or something, and putting these vegetables over to prepare for their dinner, and then taking those parts that are cut off, that are going to be discarded, not eaten, and then putting them in the compost. And then the next year, when the vegetables came up again, and they ate those vegetables, it was like magic. The vegetables turning into food, turning into waste. Did anyone bow to their poo this week, by the way? Good. A few people. Okay. That was my recommendation last week. Please do it. Oh, sorry. Tangential. But so beautiful. Now, I'm not saying, if you compost, you have no other issues to work with. I'm not saying that at all. We get those backwards sometimes, I think. But I'm saying that, think about that. That's beautiful to cultivate that. Yeah? Beautiful. And we should cultivate such a world in which we're becoming more and more and more skillful. But if we're talking about liberation, we have to find out something that is simply beyond making it better. Is there something about that composting which goes beyond just a better system? Is there something about that composting which is fundamentally liberating, in which dukkha is let go of, in which it's not the inevitable center of life? Now, I don't want to say that action couldn't be that. That's not my point here. But my point is, as we aim ourselves towards things, we can make them better. But how do we address dukkha? How do we address that anxiousness? With an intention that's constantly embroiled in delusion, grasping, cycles, dukkha, or suffering. What can we do with that intention? Well, in the way that I'm talking about today, we can awaken to that fundamental freedom itself, not to the way that we enact it in the world as a subject-object experience, a subject experiencing objects, even if those objects are internal to myself. And as we awaken to that fundamental freedom, then our action can be animated by wisdom. It's animated by wisdom rather than animated by delusion. This is very foundational Buddhism, that the delusion is what buys into the subject and object world as being what is true. Now notice I'm saying this very carefully. I'm not saying that wisdom says there's no subjects and objects. Wisdom is the one that says, of course there's subjects and objects, but subjects and objects are an expression of no subject and no object. They're not, subjects and objects are not just inevitable. They arise together. There's a great freedom both within the world of subjects and objects and in the world of no subject and no object. This is the essential freedom of consciousness, not just to be on the side of non-differentiation, to be on the side of there's nothing, there's no subjects and no objects, but to realize that the subject-object relationship is not just how it is. See, when we think it's just how it is, then we are in a world where we're just moving around saying, well, I'm a subject, there's nothing I can do about it, I have to act upon objects. And the cycles just keep going and going and going and going. And this says, no, actually subjects and objects can arise from something different than my buying into subjects and objects as the only thing that there is. And so in meditation, we step backward. People heard this expression before, very, Dogen Zenji was very fond of it, and many of the ancestors before him that he took it from. They describe meditation as taking the backward step. Taking the backward step that turns the light and allows it to shine back. So if you think about how when you're walking and you're looking out there, you always have to be navigating, right? Like you need to identify those objects because your subject is going to run into them if you don't. Just to walk around, you have to do that, right? So this expression of meditation is saying it's not another form of walking forward and identifying objects and trying to navigate. It's saying, oh no, rather than having the light shine out this way, the consciousness go out there to produce objects, let the light be whole. Let the light be simply present as itself. Let it turn back. Let the illumination be present without turning it into something. Now, in the very classical teachings, there was a very strong emphasis on the total renunciation of the outward. So the early followers of the Buddha, Shakyamuni, were renunciates. There were householders too who were his followers, but the people who were considered to really be kind of doing it, at least in the early years and in different ways throughout the past 2,500 years, were the people who were totally renouncing the world of the subject-object split. They were living as bhikkhus and bhikshunis, meaning they gave up everything. They have a robe and a bowl, a needle, a straw for filtering water. I think that's it. That's all you could have. And so they lived in a total relinquishment of creating outward navigation. And they allowed the illumination of a simple and present mind to be their sole vocation. And the people around them support them. That's their job, to support them in that activity. It's very beautiful. Some traditions still maintain this very clearly. Our tradition doesn't so much. It's beautiful, but it also can be really sidetracking if you're not going to become a total renunciate. You can think like, well, okay, then what does the teaching have to do with me? And a kind of well, you can't really live that way, split arises in people's minds. They say, well, you can't really live that way. I still have to pay the bills. I still need to take care of my kids. I still need to wash the dishes. I still need to, have fun sometimes, all this sort of stuff. And so this teaching just seems like, if I'm not going to be a renunciate, then why does it matter? Well, I would say it's just the opposite of this. It actually matters deeply and completely for the non-renunciate life. Because all of the ways in which we're engaging in the world as objects exacerbate those karmic cycles, and they make us feel anxious. But there's another way to do all those things. It has to do with waking up to the way that we are completely embedded in living. We are completely embedded in living. There is no fundamental subject and object outside of your conceiving of the subject and object. We are operating on each other and through each other all the time. This is why last week I was saying, let the flies in. Let your life be impinged upon, right? Because if your life is not being impinged upon by anything, you're in trouble, right? You're isolated. That this embeddedness in living, that is the freedom of consciousness. It's right at the very center seat of the freedom of consciousness. That kind of prajna that I'm talking about, the wisdom which can animate our activity, it is present in how we are with each other. It's not just something that comes in from outside. It is our friendships, it's our families, it's our communities, it's our countries. And we're all deeply interpenetrated. So really we have to wake up to this freedom, which is not about making other things into objects, but this freedom in which our total intertwinement animates how it is that I will act. It's not escaping life, but fully living. And this includes our big ideas. There's part of me that wants to say, freedom isn't about all this big grandiose thinking about what your life is going to be about. There was a David Brooks, he's a commentator for New York Times article in 2011, which I copied and I used to pass out to my students, and we would talk about it and debate it. It's called, "It's Not About You." And David Brooks is a conservative commentator, although he's not looking very conservative these days compared to the rest of the political spectrum. But he's really advocate for kind of embeddedness in society. And in this article, he's saying, look, graduates, everyone has filled you full of this idea of you need to find out who you really are and what you're really going to do. And when you find that out and figure it out, then you can have a fulfilling life because you figured out what it is yours to do. And he's saying, it's just the opposite. You don't know what you want to do. You're 20, 22, 24, whatever. Some of you do maybe, but probably you don't. And so the way you figure out what you want to do is you make sacred commitments to partners, to vocations, to society. And then the fruit of those sacred commitments is knowing who you are. It's not something you do first, and then you do who you are. You know who you are through those sacred commitments. I thought it was a really good article. And people argue with it, and I think that's good too. But this would be exactly my point here, is the embeddedness, right, is the chance for us to find out who we are. We don't find out who we are in isolation and then enact it upon the world. We find out who we are through the sacred commitments of being alive, which includes what you eat and a whole bunch of other things. So meditation will allow us that spaciousness, to let go of that outward grasping after the object, even if the object is myself. Right? And in this, there's a real deep liberation. There's a light that shines right in the things of the world, but we can only know it if we don't learn to stop treating them as the objects of my attention. When you practice meditation, don't treat yourself like one of those objects. That's been my point. Any questions or rebuttals?
Hi.
Hi.
In the context of your talk, suffering, liberation, would you speak a little about anicca?
So anicca is the Sanskrit term for impermanence. It means that things are not permanent. It's the side of time. Oftentimes the teachings will be about time and they'll be about space. So anatta means no self. And that's the side which is a teaching about space. That we are not independent beings. Right? If we look around, the people who are here, anatta, if I say I'm not a self, the not self doesn't mean there's no ejo here. It just means that I'm not here independently of all the other beings that are here. If we just focus on humans, I don't know, that's maybe 25 of us or something. Okay? So anicca is much like that, but it's the same principle through time. So I'm not here, right, without all the things that have come before and without all the things which will unfold after. My current beingness is completely intertwined with those things. So for the practice of meditation or for liberation, when we wake up to that, we no longer have to work in the terms of locating the objects of our desire that we're going to drive towards, or my aversions, which I'm going to try to get away from. But rather, we can set our minds on the liberation. We can set our minds on how it is that me and all those other beings throughout time are waking up to their own wholeness. That we awaken to that through the encounter of the moment-to-moment impermanence of living. I'm not saying we should just have the ideal, like I should think about all the people in the past and all the people in the future and how I'm interconnected with them. And we can do that, that's wonderful. But through meditation, that's not what we're doing. Through meditation, what we're doing is we're finding out how, actually, I was going to say that's how long there is. But the Buddha said it's 1/64th of that. Mm-hmm. He said it's 1/64th of the snap of a finger. That's how long anything is. It's just a constant movement. As we wake up to that in our own consciousness, then our inner penetration is self-evident because we see it through time. And that's why we're trying to open up our minds so that we're not caught in these layers of chunks that we just hold on to as being true or real. I would say one of the ways that shows up in meditation that's really difficult is we lose things we love. And the losing something that we love is tragic. But it also is an invitation to waking up to the moment-to-moment luminosity of life. And so when we stay present with that sense of loss, that's one way to understand impermanence, when we lose something, right? Which we think the loss itself is the dukkha, but it's not. The dukkha comes from someplace else. Things coming and going is not what produces dukkha. That's actually light. That's actually life. But the dukkha comes from the way in which we grab onto things. So the loss of something that we deeply love tells us about our own grasping and about the luminosity that is present in things. You know, we shouldn't be locked in this cult of death, where dying keeps us from living because we're afraid of losing something we love. Why do we love it? Because it's alive. And we are completely interpenetrated with it. That's love. And in that world, death is inevitable. It's not a problem. It's actually the source of our interpenetration, of our mutuality. Now, I can say all this and it sounds, I don't know, you might say, well, he's crazy. Or you might say, yeah, that sounds right. It is really, really, really grueling practice to face that directly. But it's liberating. and it's worth it because it's liberating for ourselves and for others.
Mm-hmm.
That was a little somber.
Yeah. I mean, the flip side of that, what if we didn't die?
We don't.
No, I mean, technologically, we're all excited about extending human life, maybe 200, maybe 300.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It just that's not so
I think
inspiring.
My guess, I'm going to just give you totally my guess about this. As we become better at that, we will begin to see the problem in it. I believe we will. Right now, it's still tenuous enough, right? We've extended life quite a bit, but we haven't unlocked these core things. When those get unlocked, if they get unlocked, I don't know. Some people have big faith that they will be. Other people, I think like, man, there's a mystery that's really deep here. And science has a kind of arrogance of thinking it's figured things out. I sort of think, nah, maybe not so much. But let's say we do. Let's say we do get it to 200, 300, 400 kind of average lifespan. I think we'll wake up to the problems with that. We'll see. Anyone else? Hi.
Hey, good morning. So what is the relationship between dukkha and, I guess, being able or allowing yourself to make mistakes but learning from them?
Oh yeah. Very good question. Dukkha, trying to avoid dukkha is not trying to avoid making mistakes. In many ways, the kind of anxiousness comes from overguardedness, where we're not willing to make mistakes. And because we want to save, that whatever that pattern that's unfolding, right? We want it to go the place that we want it to go. We're doing everything we can. A mistake is getting off of that trajectory, right? Like I'm not doing the things that I'm supposed to be doing to make this thing happen that I think is going to happen. In a way, the mistake is the best thing that can happen, because then you can't fulfill it. And then you have to find some other way to do it. And in that finding some other way to do it, you might say, oh, how about I don't just treat this as a subject-object project? What if I did it in another way? The way that shows up within the perfections, for example, something that I really emphasize in those teachings are do things wholeheartedly, knowing that there will be at least a part of it that is mistaken. And then you can wake up to the mistaken part and you can further find the liberation in it. So a really great example of this is like when you give someone a gift and you think you're being really, really pure. You're just like, oh, I want you to be happy, so I gave you this gift. And then you give them the gift, and maybe they're not like appreciative enough, or maybe they're not as excited about the gift as you were, or maybe they don't get you a gift when it's your birthday, or whatever it is. You start finding all these ways that you were actually attached in a way you didn't think you were attached about the gift. Oh, how cool is that? Then you get to like say, oh, okay, next time I give a gift, I'm going to watch that. I'm going to watch that part. And I'm going to say, oh, I don't want to do that. I mean, this is a fairly benign kind of mistake we might make, which is internal. But I say bigger mistakes are the same way. And so the mistake becomes like really important to our embeddedness in living. I guess that's what I would say. When I was coming back from Japan, after I'd finished a certain amount of training, and I had asked my teacher if it would be okay if I came back here to start a temple, and he supported me in that. And people would ask me, they're like, oh, when you go back to the US, what are you going to do? And I'd say, oh, I'm going to establish a temple. And they would always say to me, they would say, oh, what a nice dream you have. Mm-hmm. And I would get so angry because I was like, it's not a dream. It's what I'm doing. I mean, in a way, I wasn't even here yet, right? But to me, it wasn't a dream. It was my vow, right? It was what I was going to do. And so living that way, so you see the difference there? If it's a dream, you're kind of holding it out there. You're not embedded in it. Maybe you do things in that direction, or maybe you don't. But when you transform your dream into what you're actually doing, then it's just like nothing but a mistake. and then but that mistake is the way in which your life springs from it. It's like the compost, and what you thought you were going to do won't be what you're doing. But that's the blessing, because when it's not what you thought you were going to do, then it can be what it actually is, and then a temple can come about. If you hold it too tightly onto what you thought it was going to be, then it'll never be there. So I'm a big fan of mistakes. Yeah. But the thing about that, not nice thing, the difficult thing about this, we can't try to make mistakes, because then they're not mistakes. I mean, that might be a mistake to try to make mistakes. So go ahead and do that, and then you'll figure out. Maybe we have time for one more. If anyone.
Hey, Joe.
Hi.
I have an observation.
Hi.
That we're living in a moment, and maybe these moments occur over and over again throughout history, where we're very, very sensitive. Many of us, many individuals, are working to know what to do about the suffering and injustice experienced by others. And something about that feels insufficient, or it leaves something behind, is my sense.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to unpack that for myself.
Yeah. So, in a very simple sense, I think what it leaves out is our own suffering. And I mean that on a few levels. One level is that as we're trying to see the way in which injustice has created suffering for others, the deep pain that is present there, if we become too transfixed by the pain that is over there, we can only deal with it as an object, because it's this kind of projection out into the world, that a deep awakening to our own suffering, just on a very fundamental level, injustice, no injustice, whatever, aside from it, just our own suffering is foundational. And then to have the insight into how whatever suffering is inflicted through injustice that moves this direction also moves this direction. Everyone's life is diminished. It doesn't mean everyone is getting equal brunt of the injustice. I don't mean that at all. But I mean everyone's life is unmistakably diminished by a world in which subjects have their way with objects. And so I believe there's a real role that Buddha Dharma has to play in that rising to the current moment, to express that really clearly. I don't think that's the only message by any stretch of the imagination, but I think that's something that through the Buddha Dharma, and particularly through meditation, that we can be clearer and clearer about as Buddhas.